The year was 1876, in the Dakota Territory, when the bell of St. Eliza's Church tolled and the square filled with dust, boots, and murmurs, for this was the day 7 suitors would claim their brides. Girls stood in a stiff row, their dresses plain but brushed clean, hair tied with faded ribbons, hands clasped tightly as though prayer alone could decide their fate. The steward, a broad man with sweat darkening his collar, read names from a ledger as though they were cattle being tallied. One by one, the men stepped forward, each with coins jangling in pockets or with fathers nodding from the crowd, and each placed a hand on a girl's shoulder. The first bride wept softly and clutched the arm of her chosen, relief flooding her face as the townsfolk cheered. The second girl smiled shyly as her suitor bowed his head, and whispers of blessing rippled through the women gathered near the well. The third, the fourth, the fifth were claimed in quick succession, and every choice seemed to harden the shame building at the far end of the line where Maribel stood. She was not ugly nor bent with age, but her eyes carried the hollows of hunger, and her cheeks bore the sun's kiss too harshly, and worse than all, she carried a blue shawl so faded it was nearly gray, draped around her thin shoulders. It was the last thing her mother had pressed into her arms before fever took her, and though years had worn its threads, Maribel would not part with it. Yet to the crowd it was a mark of curse, a thing whispered about in kitchens and behind pews, that no man would dare touch a woman who clung to death's cloth. By the time the 6th bride was chosen and led away with flowers tossed at her feet, Maribel alone remained, clutching the shawl tighter, her heart drumming so loud she thought the whole square might hear it. A child tugged at his mother's apron and asked in a voice clear as a bell, "Why is she still there?" The woman hushed him quickly, but an elder beside her muttered, "Because no man wants what the grave has touched." Laughter burst from a corner of the crowd, coarse and cruel, and it spread until the air was thick with it. Maribel's lips trembled, but she pressed her chin high, refusing to bow her head, though tears burned her eyes. The steward shifted uneasily, for his ledger was balanced, 7 suitors, 7 brides, and yet here stood one, spoiling the neatness of the count. He strode toward her and laid a heavy hand on her shoulder, whispering sharply, "Girl, the choosing is finished. Step down now before you shame yourself further." But Maribel's feet rooted into the dust like oak roots, and she did not stir. "Did you not hear me?" the steward hissed, louder this time, and the crowd leaned forward, eager to see her break. Still she stood, her fingers gripping the frayed ends of her shawl, as though her mother's spirit had stitched itself into those threads and bound her spine upright. A drunk's voice rolled from the saloon door. "Look at her! Left like scraps no dog would take!" The crowd howled with laughter, men slapping their thighs, women shaking their heads, children pointing with merciless glee. The 6 chosen brides lowered their eyes, some in pity, some in relief it was not them, as they were ushered away to the church for blessing. Maribel alone remained, her figure stark against the fading sunlight, her shawl glowing faintly blue in the dust. She did not move, did not weep, did not yield, and the people, silenced by her stubborn stillness, waited to see how long she could stand before her knees betrayed her. The church bells had barely faded when the laughter returned, sharper now that the brides were led inside, leaving Maribel a lone figure on the square. Some men crossed their arms, shaking their heads as though her stubbornness was insolence, while others smirked, eager for the spectacle. A group of children began to circle her, daring each other to get close, tossing pebbles near her feet, their high voices cutting like knives. "Why don't you cry, leftover?" one shouted, and another added, "Because the dead can't weep." Their mothers made no effort to stop them, for scorn seemed safer than defending her. A boy lunged forward and tugged the edge of her blue shawl, but Maribel jerked it back with a strength that startled even herself, her eyes blazing like embers in the twilight. The boy stumbled, fell, and the crowd roared with laughter, twisting her defense into shame. One of the suitors, the brother of the man who had chosen the prettiest bride, leaned against a post with a sneer. "You should thank the Lord you were spared, girl," he called. "No man needs a curse in his bed." The words struck like whips, yet Maribel forced herself not to flinch, though her hands trembled beneath the shawl's worn fabric. She thought of her mother's voice, soft but unyielding, telling her that dignity was worth more than silver or rings. So she straightened, chin lifted, eyes fixed on the church doors as though she too awaited blessing, though every whisper from the crowd was a nail driven into her skin. Hours dragged on, the sun dipping lower, shadows crawling across the square. Still she stood, refusing to move even when her knees wavered. Townswomen whispered that she was stubborn, prideful, ungrateful for being overlooked, while men muttered that no one wanted a woman cursed by her own bloodline. A toothless elder cackled, "Mark my words, she'll still be standing when the crows pick her bones." The crowd jeered at his cruelty, yet their eyes did not look away. Her defiance drew them like moths to flame, a spectacle they could not resist. A boy began to chant, "Leftover, leftover," and soon others joined, their voices ringing through the dusk. Each repetition was a hammer, but Maribel held fast, her shawl clutched to her breast, whispering silently to her mother that she would not bow, not tonight, not ever. A passing rancher paused, spat in the dust near her shoes, and muttered to no one in particular, "Best drag her away before she infects the rest with her pride." The steward shifted uneasily, torn between duty to clear the square and curiosity to see if she would break. A man in the crowd, emboldened by whiskey, stepped forward and jabbed a finger toward her face. "Go home, girl. The fair is over. You shamed the town by lingering like a ghost." Maribel's lips parted, and though her voice trembled, her words carried enough for all to hear. "I will stand until the ground itself refuses me." A hush fell, brief but heavy, before the laughter erupted again, crueler than before. The steward, red-faced, barked, "Enough! If she refuses to leave, she'll be dragged out by morning." Murmurs rippled, some amused, some unsettled, at the thought of her being torn from her place. The last of the daylight bled into the horizon, leaving torches flickering along the church walls, and Maribel's shadow stretched long and unyielding across the square. But as the laughter subsided into murmurs, a man's voice rose cold from the edge of the crowd, promising what the steward had only threatened: "She will be taken, willing or not." Night settled over the square, cool wind whispering through the cracks in the boards beneath Maribel's worn shoes, but still she did not move, her figure rigid as though carved from stone. The torches hissed in the breeze, casting her shadow tall across the church wall, while the laughter of the crowd faded into tired murmurs as folk drifted away to warm homes and supper tables. Yet even with fewer eyes upon her, the sting of shame lingered, for every whispered insult clung to her like burrs. A pair of young wives, their cheeks flushed with wine from the wedding feast, passed close by, giggling as they pointed. "She thinks herself better than us," one sneered, "standing like a queen when no one wants her." The other leaned near and hissed, "It's that shawl. Her mother died with it on her shoulders. Don't you know? That cloth carries fever's curse." Maribel's chest tightened at their words, but instead of loosening her hold, she drew the shawl closer, wrapping it until the frayed edges brushed her lips. "It isn't a curse," she whispered to herself, voice trembling but fierce. "It's the only blessing I have left." Her legs ached, her back throbbed, yet she would not kneel. She remembered her mother's final moments. The way her hand pressed the shawl into Maribel's arms, the command to live with dignity even when the world spat on her name. That memory burned brighter than hunger, steadier than fear. The square grew quieter, yet not empty. A few men lingered, leaning against posts with mugs in hand, watching her as one might watch a stubborn mule. A boy who had mocked her earlier returned, tossing a pebble that bounced against her boot, and when she did not flinch, he grinned and spat. "Ghost girl!" His father cuffed him for the word, muttering that such talk would anger spirits, and hurried him away, leaving Maribel to the silence of torchlight. Hours bled together. The music from the church hall rose and fell, the sound of laughter and clinking cups piercing the night, cruel reminders that the chosen brides were feasting while she starved in the cold. Hunger gnawed at her belly, thirst dried her throat, and yet she stood, lips pressed tight, eyes locked on the church doors as though waiting for judgment. A figure passed her, a friend of one of the brides, who whispered with a smirk, "Better to lie down in the dirt than clutch a shroud and pretend it makes you worthy." Maribel's breath caught, but she held her ground, fire burning behind her eyes though her knees wavered. She thought she heard her mother's voice again, soft but unyielding. "You are worth more than their laughter, my child. Stand tall until the dawn." And so she stood, hour after aching hour, her body trembling but her spirit hardening like iron. The torches guttered low, the square nearly empty, when a sudden sound cracked the silence. From the saloon at the far corner, boots thudded heavily, and a Suitors' brother, the same one who had sneered before, stumbled out, a mug in his hand, his grin wicked with drink. He swaggered toward her, pointing with the mug, and slurred loud enough for the last bystanders to hear. "Still standing, are you? Then let's see how long you last when someone finally puts you on the ground." The drunken man's laughter echoed through the square as he staggered closer, his mug sloshing ale onto the dust, and though a few townsfolk remained, none moved to stop him. Maribel's pulse hammered in her throat, yet she stood rooted, clutching the shawl like a shield. He reached for her arm, but the steward, red-faced from worry of scandal, stepped in and barked that the fair was ended, that she had no right to stand in the center any longer. The man grumbled but backed away with a mocking bow, muttering that she wasn't worth the trouble. With a grunt, the steward ordered her moved aside, and two men shoved her gently but firmly across the square until she found herself pressed against the porch steps of the church, beneath the heavy shadow of its cross. The bells tolled again, as the brides inside sang hymns and lifted candles for blessing, their voices drifting like honey through the doors, a cruel counterpoint to her banishment. Maribel's chest burned with shame, but her feet refused to move from the porch, as though she belonged among them even if the doors remained barred. A woman carrying bread passed by, sniffed, and said loudly to her friend, "Better she stay outside than bring curse into the Lord's house." Others gathered in knots along the edges of the square, whispering about her pride, some shaking their heads, some laughing outright. A child, curious and cruel, pointed at her and asked why the preacher did not drive her away, and his father muttered, "Because perhaps even God waits to see if she will fall." Maribel wrapped the shawl tighter, its faded threads scratching her cheek, and whispered that she would not give them the sight of her collapse. Inside, music swelled. Brides and grooms danced in the glow of lantern light, while outside she stood in the torch shadows. The porch wood rough against her back. Hunger bit, thirst burned, but memory steeled her. Her mother's face pale in fever, whispering that dignity was not a gift men granted, but a flame carried within. Still, her legs trembled, and when she stumbled a step, the crowd jeered. "There, she's faltering!" a voice cried. Maribel straightened, pressing her back to the wall, clutching the shawl until her knuckles whitened. Hours dragged on, the night thick with laughter from the feast, the torches sputtering low until the heavy doors of the church creaked open and the brides emerged, veils lifted, cheeks glowing with wine and joy. Each one passed her by with a glance of pity or disdain, and one whispered to her husband, "See, she still stands, cursed and stiff." He guided his bride away quickly, not wishing to linger near her shadow. The porch boards groaned beneath her shifting weight, her vision blurred from fatigue, yet still she would not leave. A man near the saloon spat into the dust and barked, "She'll be found stiff by dawn, shawl still clutched like a corpse's blanket." His words drew laughter, but behind it all, a hush lingered, for none could look away from the stubborn girl who refused to yield. And just as the last torch burned low, a child's voice rang out, sharp and innocent, cutting through the mocking laughter. "Why does she not fall?" The question from the child echoed in Maribel's ears long after silence swallowed the square, and though her knees shook beneath her, she steadied herself against the porch beam, clutching the shawl as if it were the only anchor in a world bent on casting her adrift. The night had grown bitter, the stars sharp above, and still she stood while the town dozed in their homes, leaving only stragglers drifting between the saloon and the church steps. One of those stragglers, the brother of a chosen bridegroom, reeled from the saloon with rage on his breath, his eyes red, his boots uneven against the dust. He spotted her silhouette against the porch torchlight and barked a laugh that froze her marrow. "Still here? What kind of fool are you?" he slurred, stumbling closer until his shadow swallowed hers. His friends jeered from behind him, egging him on. "Take her then, if no one else will," one shouted, and the man grinned a wolfish grin, his hand outstretched as if claiming her by right. The crowd that lingered tensed, some too drunk to care, some too eager for spectacle, and Maribel's heart thundered so loud she thought it might break her ribs. She pulled the shawl tighter, but he seized her wrist with iron grip, shaking her like a rag. "You want to stand so proud? Then stand in my house!" His words dripped with malice, and the crowd laughed nervously, for they sensed the line between jest and violence thinning. Maribel gasped, yanking against his grip, but he only tightened his hold, dragging her from the porch step. In desperation, she cried, "I would rather rot alone in the dust than bow to your hand." Her voice, sharp as broken glass, cut the night, silencing even the drunks for a breath. He snarled, face twisted with humiliation at her defiance, and raised his free hand high, palm open to strike her down before the watching eyes. Maribel's breath hitched, her grip crushing the shawl as if she could pull her mother's spirit from its threads, bracing for the blow that would brand her forever. The crowd leaned forward, some gasping, some grinning, waiting to see if the proud girl would finally be broken in front of them all. When suddenly, from the edge of the square, a deep voice rang out in Lakota, steady and commanding, and the drunkard froze mid-swing, his hand suspended in the air like a guilty thief caught beneath heaven's gaze. The Lakota words rolled through the square like thunder across open plains, strange and sharp to the townsfolk, but heavy enough to halt the drunkard's raised hand in mid-air. For a heartbeat, no one moved, torches sputtering in the breeze, shadows dancing across the church wall. Then, from the edge of the darkness, a tall figure stepped into the torchlight, his shoulders broad, his braids glinting with beads that caught the firelight, his eyes steady as a hawk's. He did not stride forward with violence, but with a calm that made the jeering men fall silent. The drunkard cursed under his breath and dropped Maribel's wrist as though burned, backing a step though pride kept his chin high. "This is none of your affair," he spat, though his voice wavered. The warrior did not answer in English, only set his hand firmly on the drunkard's arm, lowering it with strength that needed no show. Then, without another glance at him, the warrior turned his eyes on Maribel. She trembled, not with fear, but with the aftershock of nearly being struck, and she clutched her shawl tighter to her chest, meeting his gaze with something between awe and disbelief. The crowd murmured now, restless, for his presence unsettled them more than her defiance had. "He should leave," one woman whispered. "What business has he in our square?" Another muttered, "Better to let her rot than have one of them meddle." The steward, red-faced and sweating, shouted for order, insisting the girl must be gone by dawn, whether she stood or no. Yet Maribel, steadied by the memory of her mother's voice, lifted her chin and said nothing, her silence more defiant than any scream. The drunken man slunk back toward the saloon, nursing his pride, but others in the crowd hissed warnings at the warrior, saying his presence would bring trouble. Still he remained, silent as stone, watching with a gaze that unsettled the night itself. Hours crept by. The feast inside the church dwindled to quiet singing, and still Maribel stood, though her knees wobbled and her stomach cried with hunger. The widow who had pitied her earlier approached from the edge of the crowd and whispered hoarsely, "Child, go home. No shawl, no memory is worth what they will do to you." Maribel shook her head, too weary to speak, but the woman saw the fire still burning in her eyes and stepped back, pitying and afraid. The crowd began to chant again, softer now, mocking her with curses, calling her cursed bride, unwanted ghost, prideful sinner, yet Maribel fixed her gaze on the horizon where dawn would soon break. The warrior's shadow never moved far, always watching, though he did not speak again. The steward barked once more. "If she remains when the bells strike dawn, she will be dragged away." The words carried finality, echoed by the nods of men eager for spectacle. Maribel clutched her shawl so tight her knuckles whitened, whispering silently to her mother's memory, "I will not yield, not while breath is still mine." And though her spirit held, her body betrayed her, for as the torch nearest her sputtered out, her knees buckled slightly and the crowd gasped in delight, sure she was about to collapse at last. Her knees buckled, and a triumphant cry rose from the crowd, but before she could collapse fully, a strong hand caught her elbow and steadied her upright. Gasps rippled across the square as the torchlight revealed the Lakota warrior standing at her side, his presence no longer distant, but undeniable. He did not hold her as a man might claim possession, but as one might steady a comrade, his grip firm yet respectful. Maribel's breath hitched, her heart hammering as she looked up into his face, scarred by weather yet striking, his eyes burning with a fire that was not mockery but recognition. The townsfolk hissed with outrage, some clutching at their rosaries, others muttering about defilement of sacred ground. The steward stormed forward, pointing a shaking finger at the warrior. "This is no place for you. She is our shame, not your concern." But the warrior did not move, did not speak, only turned his gaze on the steward with such calm authority that the man faltered mid-step. The drunkard who had tried to strike Maribel earlier spat from the edge of the saloon, shouting that no Lakota would steal what no white man wanted, and the crowd laughed uneasily, torn between fear and anger. Still the warrior remained, steady as a mountain. His shadow cast across Maribel's trembling form as though shielding her from the weight of their scorn. Maribel clutched her shawl tighter, the frayed blue cloth warm beneath her hands, and whispered almost soundlessly, "Mother, I am not alone." The words gave her strength, enough to straighten once more, though her body screamed for rest. The crowd murmured, unsettled, for her defiance seemed now bolstered by his silent guardianship, and what they had laughed at as folly began to feel like challenge. The steward, his pride wounded, bellowed that dawn would decide her fate, that when the bells tolled, she would be dragged away and the warrior beaten if he dared interfere. His words were meant to cow them both, yet Maribel felt no fear now, only a strange calm, as if the shawl carried not just her mother's memory, but a shield of dignity woven through its frayed edges. Hours slipped by as the last of the torches waned and the stars faded, leaving the square bathed in pale moonlight. The warrior did not leave her side, though he spoke no word, and his silence was louder than all the jeers combined. A boy asked his father why the warrior stood there, and the man, glancing nervously at the calm strength in his posture, muttered, "Because even stone can see worth where men see none." Dawn's first light brushed the horizon, painting the square with gray. Maribel swayed, the long night carved into the lines of her face, her legs trembling like reeds in wind. But she did not fall, upheld as much by spirit as by the presence of the man beside her. The steward, desperate to reclaim control, raised his staff and shouted for the men of the town to ready themselves, that as soon as the bells struck, they would drag her from the porch, whether she stood or clung to it. The crowd stirred, restless, some eager, some uneasy, while Maribel braced herself for the moment of violence she had always known would come. And as the first bell of dawn began to toll, the warrior at her side lifted his head, his voice low and steady in his own tongue, words the crowd could not understand. But Maribel felt them in her bones, a promise that the hour of her judgment would not belong to them alone. The first toll of the bell rattled through the square, deep and heavy, a summons not just to prayer, but to judgment. And as its echo faded, the steward lifted his staff high and barked for the men to step forward. Boots shuffled, hesitant but obedient, for though some were eager to see Maribel dragged away, others glanced uneasily at the tall Lakota standing like a pillar beside her. He had not moved, not spoken, yet his stillness carried more weight than their jeers, and even the boldest hesitated. Maribel's knees trembled, her body ached with hunger and weariness, but she clutched her blue shawl tighter, wrapping it across her shoulders until the frayed edges crossed her heart. Her mother's voice seemed to echo from its threads, whispering of dignity that outlived scorn. The crowd murmured as the steward called again, ordering her seized. Two men stepped forward reluctantly, their eyes darting toward the warrior, who shifted only enough to place his body more fully between them and Maribel. The torchlight had died, leaving dawn's gray to creep across the square, and in that pale light his figure seemed carved from the earth itself. A woman muttered, "Why does he care? She is nothing." And another whispered, "Perhaps he sees what we do not." Maribel, swaying but unyielding, drew breath enough to speak, her voice raw but clear. "I stand because I must. Not for you, not for him, but for her." She clutched the shawl. "And I will not bow." Gasps rippled, for no woman left unchosen had ever dared answer back. Yet her defiance struck deeper now with the warrior's silent watch at her side. The steward, furious, shouted for her to be dragged away, but the men hesitated still, muttering that it was ill fortune to touch one so stubborn while guarded by eyes that saw more than theirs. The bells tolled again, and the crowd leaned forward, straining for the breaking point. Inside the church, the last of the hymns faded, and brides blessed and wedded emerged with their grooms, their laughter dying as they beheld the scene. Maribel still standing, shawl across her chest, the Lakota's shadow cast over her like a mantle. One bride whispered to another, "Why does he not take her already, if he must?" And the words stirred through the crowd like dry grass catching flame. A new murmur rose, not of curses but of uneasy curiosity. The warrior's eyes did not leave Maribel, and in them she read no pity, only acknowledgement. As if her long night of standing had carved her into something the rest of them could not erase. Yet just as dawn crept brighter, the steward, desperate and cornered, cried that if the men would not drag her, the sheriff himself would see her cast from the square. The crowd stirred, and the drunkard from the night before staggered out again, shouting that he would see her humbled if no one else dared. He lurched toward the porch, fists balled, face twisted with rage. Maribel gripped the shawl as the bells tolled once more, and though her body shook, her voice rose steady and sharp. "You may break me, but you cannot take this from me." She lifted the shawl high against the morning light, and the crowd gasped as the drunkard lunged, only to find the Lakota warrior step fully into his path, his hand raised not in threat but in command, and the next strike, if it came, would not land upon her alone. The square erupted as the drunkard stumbled back from the warrior's hand, his pride wounded more than his flesh, and he bellowed like a wounded bull, calling for the men of the town to stand with him. "Will you let one of them shame us before our own church?" he shouted, spit flying, his words stoking the embers of anger in the crowd. Some cheered, some jeered, but many hesitated, for the sight of Maribel still standing with her shawl lifted high had unsettled them, and the Lakota's silent presence weighed heavier than their bravado. The steward, red with fury, barked that the girl must be cast out before the final bell, that no cursed shawl should linger on the porch of God. Two men surged forward, emboldened by the drunkard's roar, and seized at Maribel's arms, but she twisted, clinging to the shawl so fiercely that the fabric nearly tore. Her cry pierced the morning, not of fear, but of desperate defiance. "You will not take it from me." The crowd gasped as she fell to her knees, yet even in the dust she held the shawl aloft, trembling arms raised like an offering to heaven. The drunkard laughed cruelly, stepping in to snatch it, but before his hand touched the cloth, the Lakota warrior moved, swift as a storm, planting himself between them. Gasps rippled as he spoke in clear English now, his voice low yet carrying. "She has stood longer, braver, and truer than any bride you cheered. Touch her again, and you shame yourselves." The words cut like iron, and silence followed, broken only by the restless shuffle of boots. Some men scowled, muttering about pride and trespass, yet others lowered their eyes, for the truth in his voice could not be denied. Maribel, still kneeling, clutched the shawl tighter, her body broken with fatigue, yet her spirit burning brighter than dawn. The steward raged, insisting the sheriff would settle it, but no man moved forward, not even the drunkard, whose courage faltered beneath the warrior's steady gaze. Murmurs swelled as the last bell neared, the crowd torn between old scorn and a growing sense of awe. A woman whispered, "She has endured what none of us could," and her words struck others like a hidden spark. Maribel forced herself upright again, staggering but unbowed, the shawl draped across her shoulders like a mantle of defiance. Her breath came ragged, her eyes hollow with exhaustion, yet she met the crowd's gaze and declared, "I am not cursed, I am my mother's daughter, and I will not fall." The warrior's hand hovered at her back, steady but not controlling. And for the first time, Maribel felt the weight of her burden shared, not taken. The drunkard, humiliated, shouted once more that she was nothing, a leftover, a ghost. But his words rang hollow now, drowned by the hush of a people who no longer laughed. And as the final bell drew breath to toll, the steward raised his staff high in one last attempt to cast her out, only for the Lakota to step forward, seize the staff mid-swing, and snap it clean across his knee. The sound cracked through the square like thunder, and the crowd recoiled in shock as the last bell's note began to rise. The crack of the staff breaking silenced the square as surely as thunder silences birds in flight. And when the last bell tolled its heavy note across the town, all eyes fixed upon the Lakota warrior standing tall with the splintered wood cast at his feet. The steward stumbled backward, his authority shattered, and none dared step forward, not even the drunkard whose bluster had withered beneath the weight of that act. Maribel swayed on trembling legs, her breath ragged, the blue shawl clutched across her chest like a banner, and though exhaustion threatened to topple her, she remained upright, as if the roots of her mother's memory held her firm. The warrior turned, his gaze meeting hers, not with pity, but with recognition, as though in her long night of humiliation he had witnessed a spirit unbroken, a strength that no jeer, no hand, no law could steal. Slowly, reverently, he reached for the shawl, his fingers brushing the frayed edge, and for an instant Maribel's instinct was to clutch tighter, fearing even this would be torn from her. But he did not take it away. Instead, he lifted it gently, spreading it wide, and then draped it across both their shoulders, binding them beneath its faded blue as the crowd watched in stunned silence. A murmur rippled through the townsfolk, not of laughter now but of shame, for what they had mocked as curse was revealed as mantle, a cloak of dignity no man could buy or bargain. The brides and their grooms lowered their eyes, humbled by the sight of the one left unchosen now honored more than all. Maribel's tears finally fell, not of weakness but of release, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Mother, I have not bowed." The warrior's hand rested light upon her arm, steady as stone, and he spoke in English so all could hear. "She stood when all others were chosen. She stood when you called her nothing. I claim her, not as pity, but as proof that strength endures." His words rolled across the square, sinking deep into the hearts of those who had jeered, and some turned away, ashamed of their cruelty. The steward, red-faced and trembling, dared not speak, for his broken staff lay like a warning at his feet. In that silence, Maribel straightened fully, the shawl warm against her skin, no longer a relic of shame, but a living bond between past and future. She stepped forward with the warrior at her side, each footfall echoing like a judgment, and though the crowd parted in uneasy silence, none lifted a hand to stop them. The sun broke the horizon at last, gilding the faded shawl with gold, and in that light it seemed new again, threads shimmering as if her mother's spirit walked with her. Together they crossed the square, leaving behind the jeers, the shame, the long night, until only whispers trailed after them. Some said she had been chosen by curse, others that she had been saved by chance. But Maribel knew the truth, that she had stood alone, and by standing had been seen. And as the warrior guided her toward the open road, she pressed the shawl against her heart, knowing it had carried her from humiliation to honor, from solitude to strength, until the world itself was forced to see her worth. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Echoes of the West. If you had seen her still standing with only her mother's shawl for courage, would you have stepped forward too?